So thank you for coming, and welcome to this session that I think, it was a moment ago. Let me speak closer. I beg your pardon. So this is the session for Policy and Diplomacy for Peace and Sustainable Development, which I think gets at the heart of the theme of this World Science Forum. We will be talking about science for policy. Of course, there is policy for science to help with international science projects and so forth. But here we are talking about how we can integrate science and scientific thinking and scientific procedures into the policies around the world. And a central theme of this forum is the need for scientists to engage locally, nationally, and internationally with policymakers, with leaders, with decision makers, and opinion makers in order to devise sustainable solutions to global challenges. Difficult problems, are usually solved by looking at them from many perspectives. Only rarely can you find many perspectives within one person. There needs to be, usually, for tough problems, a collective approach. And so the question is, how can we have science-informed policy? It doesn't come easily, and I think it is something that many people at this forum think about. We have on the panel today some people who can help us think about it and can talk about specific mechanisms that have been used, approaches that have been used or that are being used. Strengthening the science policy interface really requires breaking down silos. It means changing the culture among scientists. It means finding a way to get the policymakers to want to include science in their decision making. And that might be the toughest job of all. The career incentives and rewards are not there for scientists to be involved in policy, but even more, the career incentives and the professional culture is not there to encourage policymakers to reach out to bring in science. The way we do science, which is asking questions so that they can be answered with evidence in a verifiable way so that findings are communicated openly and scientists invite others to check their work. That is science, quite simply. And that approach can be used in policy making, yes, even foreign policy making. It has a place in diplomacy as well as in climate science, energy science, climate policy, energy policy, agricultural policy, nutrition policy, and so forth. And a critical way of instilling these scientific principles in the policy community, a necessary way, is personal. You do not, I believe, create this scientific approach through text, through books. It has to be done with someone who is teaching you how to think critically, someone who is teaching you how to reach out for evidence, or more, how to develop a reverence for evidence. So a critical way of instilling this policy, one way, I should say, of instilling this policy, this approach to policy, we do at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For 45 years now, we have placed PhD level scientists and engineers in our federal government. This year we have 250 PhD level scientists in the Foreign Office, in the Development Office, in the Health and Human Services Department, in even, I think, the Army Corps of Engineers. And they bring with them the science perspective that is so often missing in the bureaucracy, in the policy making, in the central part of the policy making agencies. And this is a time-tested method where these PhD scientists have a declared interest in being involved in policy making, and they go through an excellent orientation and training program to learn techniques, to build a network with other policy fellows, and to be reminded that they are not there to provide the answers for the policymakers, but rather to help the policymakers get to the right answer. And it has, there are now more than 3,000 of those alumni, a couple of whom you will hear from. It is, I was one of those fellows some decades ago, and it was a great experience for me. I would like to think that I helped the member of Congress for whom I worked think about things in a way differently than he ever did otherwise. Today we'll be discussing innovative approaches and mechanisms such as this. We'll hear from another science and technology policy alumna, Dr. Mandy Holford, and from other experts who can talk about approaches that are being tried. Science diplomacy is not just about government action. It's not just about policy making, but it is about finding out how science can illuminate the process, the diplomacy process, as well as the policy-making process. And it's not just about governments. I think we have to find the way to make sure that advocates and scientists, so NGO advocates, for example, and scientists and the public demand that the policymakers and the diplomats are looking for ways to integrate science into their work. So let me introduce our distinguished panel who are joining us. And I think in the following order, I will ask them each to say a few words, and then we'll have a more general discussion with you. Dr. Mandy Holford is professor of chemistry at the City University of New York, Hunter College, and research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. As I mentioned, an alumna of the Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program of AAAS. Dr. Nita Lipman will be joining us on the screen, is the founding director of the MIMSHAC Science Policy Fellowships Program and director of the Israel Society of Ecology and Environmental Studies. Dr. Hawad El-Karaz is director of research at the Middle East Desalination Research Center. Vani Narita is a recent ASEAN Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And Dr. Marga Solar is project director at AAAS, where I am, in the Center for Science Diplomacy. Kathleen Campbell will then lead the discussion. She is a visiting scholar at AAAS and the former CEO of CRDF Global in the United States. So let's see, I guess Mandy first.
Okay. Sure. So I'll stand. Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Rush, for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to share with you how my fellowship, I was a AAAS fellow, as Rush said, how science and technology fellowships in general can be used to bridge the gap between STEM and policy. Next slide. So first, to set some terms so we're all on the same page, when I talk about bridging STEM and policy, I'm talking about how we can take what scientists are doing in the lab, where we are learning all of these skills and developing new tools, how we can transform and translate these in ways that will lead to impactful policy decisions in the boardroom, right? So this is the bridge that we're trying to create when we talk about bridging STEM and policy. And we have right now we have an important reason for why we want to do this effectively. The SDG goals, as they've been laid out, are 17 agenda items, and of these 17, a significant amount have science and technology at their core. So I like to call this a call to arms for scientists and policymakers to really figure out how we can communicate effectively, how we can work collaboratively to make initiatives that are beneficial for both science and society. And so one tool that I think is very effective for doing that is the establishment of these science and technology policy fellowships. And a big part of these fellowships is building human capital. So we need to be able to build human capital that will be in a way that will help us mitigate some of the threats, the global threats that are occurring, whether it's climate change to nuclear arms, but also to seize on a lot of the opportunities that are happening, which you saw in the opening session. I mean, a greeting from space. How is this possible? We have to be able to mitigate that, and scientists and policymakers have to be the ones that set up the initiatives to do so. We also saw the first humanoid robot. Again, what does that mean in terms of ethics? Is it a human? Should it be governed by laws that are similar to the laws that govern humans? A critical conversation that can't happen without scientists in the room. So when we think about how do we bridge the gap between STEM and policy, it's because we have to build all of these things. We have to address these things that are happening, and in order to build that capital, these fellowship programs are enabling that to happen. So the next slide. So I think there are three elements to building human capital in science diplomacy, and I'm going to give you just a brief overview of these three. First is cultural dexterity. So the young scientists here, we had an advantage on you guys. We started one day earlier. So we started yesterday with a great workshop that was led by No Innovation, where we talked about all scientists are very well versed in dealing with complex technical issues, right? This is what we're trained for. But we're not necessarily trained to conduct science diplomacy because beyond technical expertise, what diplomats have to deal with every day is cultural sensitivity. So you would not be an effective diplomat if you did not know the cultural norms of the country you were trying to liaise with, right? And the same as a scientist. You cannot be an effective science diplomat if you're not aware of the cultural norms that are necessary. And something even as simple as learning the language of the country you're speaking to can speak bounds, and also it forces you to get out of your head and into the cultural head of somebody else. The next step? Training. So this we'll talk a little bit more about. So we are, as I said, we get a very diverse technical training as scientists, but we don't get any policy training. And as diplomats, you are trained throughout the career. So policymakers and diplomats, at least in the States, foreign affairs officers, they take an exam, and they don't take it once, they take it several times throughout their career. So they're always being tested, and their skills are always being honed on how to do their job effectively. So it's a kind of a rational thing to think that scientists shouldn't be trained on how to become science diplomats, and you should be able to just leap from the bench and head into a policy meeting without getting those skills. The third thing is global governance. So you sort of have to know the landscape of what you're doing. It's kind of like playing chess. You don't make a move until you've seen the whole board. And you'd be surprised at how many scientists don't understand how multinational organizations work, either bilaterally or on a multinational level to achieve some of the initiatives that enable science and technology, such as the space station, such as Sesame, a great example that you guys have here. That's a collaboration that took several nations to come together, and if you were to ask certain scientists what are the names of those organizations, they would not know. So in order for us as scientists to actively step into the role as a science diplomat, we have to have some of these elements. And so today, the one that I'm going to speak most prominently on is, next slide, is training. And the training specifically through Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, right? So as Rush said, I am a proud AAAS Science and Technology Fellow, and my slide's a little dated. It's 45 years that the program has been running, not 40. And as this program, as you've heard, what it does is it takes scientists like myself to Washington, D.C., and next slide, and we spend a year, scientists and engineer, we spend a year figuring out how to take the skills and analytical thinking that we've been doing in our PhD training into a policy setting. So you work either at the executive or the legislative branch, where you work very closely every day on a policy issue with a policymaker or with a diplomat, depending on where you're stationed in the federal government. And so I did this for a year, where I worked in the Office of International Science and Engineering. And so I was sort of, in that 1 year that I was there, I went to 9 different countries. And I was stationed in, next slide, in the Scandinavian region, and I was also stationed in the, next slide, Latin and South America. And so this was very interesting because it helped me to get, remember those 3 elements? I immediately learned about cultural norms, and I learned about global governance, right? So as you may know, the Scandinavian countries are spend the most usually on research and development. They spend the most of their GDP on research and development, which is not the case in Latin and South America. And so what that showed me is that nations that wanted to invest in science and technology were the ones who were reaping the socio-economic benefits from it, right? So in my Science and Technology Fellowship, I was exposed that 1 year to not only cultural norms, but I also got significant training, because what I was doing was setting up agreements for US scientists to travel to these nations to do exchange programs, right? So I had to learn how to speak to ministers of science. I had to learn how to speak to royalty in the case of Norway, because I met the Queen of Norway. And so there are lots of things you have to do that you wouldn't encounter. So during the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, exposed me to those 3 elements that I outlined before. I did this fellowship right after I did my PhD at the Rockefeller University, and then the second fellowship that I did, next slide, yeah. The second fellowship I did at the start when I started my independent laboratory. So I'm a chemical marine biologist, and I wanted to expand my research. And in particular, I wanted to expand it into the Persian region, into the Arabic nations. And I didn't know how. There wasn't someone I could call, unfortunately, to just say, hey, let's work together. But there's this awesome fellowship, the Arab American Frontiers in Science, Engineering, and Medicine program. I did this fellowship where, at the time that I did it, it was in Oman. It travels throughout the MENA region. It's not always in the same place. It was formerly in KAUST as well. This is an agreement where, next slide, there's buy-in from both sides. So it's sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences in the US, by USAID, by the Richard Lunsberry Foundation, and then at the time in Oman, it was funded by the Research Council. So this is where policymakers are enabling science to happen, right? So they've come together and identified that they want to make US scientists and Arabic scientists work more closer together, and so they're providing the means for us to do so. So the first year I went to the symposium. The second year I had developed a project that would enable me to come back, next slide, to the region to do, so I'm, as I said, a chemical marine biologist. We study the biodiversity of snails, and you'll see a little bit more about that. And I wanted to see if the physiology of the snails in the Persian Gulf differed from the physiology of the snails in the Indo-Pacific, where we usually do our collection. The reason is the Persian Gulf has one of the warmest waters on the planet, and so it's interesting as a microcosm, as a study of climate change, to see as temperatures rise, what will happen to these organisms. So when I did my S&T fellowship at AAAS, I had just finished my graduate program, and so when I came back to the MENA region to do my fellowship, I brought my grad students with me, so that's Juliet and Ida, and that's some of the local students that we were working with while we were here. And next slide. So what we were trying to do, as I said, was to identify if these snails had the same physiology given the rising temperatures to the ones found in other parts of the world. And so, next slide. So in doing the S&T fellowship, what I was doing was learning how to connect science with policy and diplomacy in a way that sort of featured the three tenets of science diplomacy, as Russ was mentioning, right? So science diplomacy is done both locally, nationally, and internationally. And these fellowships enabled me to experience all of that. So with the AAAS fellowship, I learned about advising when I was setting up those multinational programs where US scientists could go. In the Arab Fellowship, I was learning about how science is enabled by policymakers. And then doing those together helped me to build the confidence that allowed me to say, okay, I'm a scientist, but I know enough now that I can step into a boardroom with policymakers and explain to them why certain things about the technology I'm developing is important and why setting random regulations might not be the way to go, right? And so the reason that you're gonna love this now. So these are the snails that I work with. They're hidden under, I call them killer snails because they prey on fish, worms, and other snails. So that's the tongue of the snail, I'll call it the tongue. On the tip, it has a dart filled with venom that it's going to inject into the fish. Yeah. This is real time, we didn't speed it up. Yeah. Exactly. This is what I study. And so these snails, next slide, similar to snakes or spiders, these snails have a venom that's very lethal, even to humans. And so everywhere, next slide, you see a yellow dot is where someone has died from encountering these snails. And so if you'll notice, as I said, next slide, the MENA region is not safe. But you are a lot safer than, next slide, anywhere in the Indo-Pacific. So as long as you don't go too far or you don't get too close. They're mostly nocturnal. They don't come out during the day. And so you're pretty safe. If it's too pretty, don't touch it. The way a lot of humans have died is because when they're scuba diving, they see this gorgeous shell, they put it into their wetsuit and try to make it back up to the surface. Except they never make it back to the surface. And so these snails are similar to snakes and spiders, and in their venom, they have components such as fast-acting, they're highly specific, and they're very potent. All the ingredients you need for drugs, right? So from these animals, for millions of years, they've been honing their venom for exactly the things that drug companies are looking for. And in fact, 3 of these animals have led to drugs that are commercially available. So from the Gila monster, we have Byetta, which is being used to treat diabetes. From the Brazilian lancehead snake, we have Captopril, which is used for hypertension. And from my work, where we found with cone snails, we found a drug that is being used to treat chronic pain in HIV and cancer patients. So this is a prime example of what one would call, next slide, dual-use research, right? So here's the venom of these snails, which are lethal enough to kill you if you were to use all of the venom. But if you use specific elements of those venom, then they're also turning into medicines that can help treat disorders and disease. So that's a very nuanced conversation that a scientist has to have with a policymaker, right? Because one could envision that, next slide, that someone might weaponize these snails. It's not easy. It's not easy to do it all. And so every time that I go into a meeting with the US Agricultural Agency, or when I apply for permits to import or export these snails, you have to justify how you're not using these for weapon. So you have to outline that the benefits that these snails have, which is giving us novel medicines for treating disease and disorder, largely outweigh the potential for weaponizing them. I mean, it's possible, but you'd have to walk around with a marine tank, you'd have to get a lot of venom, you'd have to walk around with a syringe. It's not easy. I'm not gonna give you the plan for how you do that. But the importance of understanding that, yes, potentially this could be a dual-use scientific technology, but the benefits for society largely outweigh the damage that could be done. Next slide. So doing the science and technology policy fellowships sort of helped me to engage in how do I build this bridge. And having been from Brooklyn, I have to show you the Brooklyn Bridge. So how do I build this bridge where I can take my science literally out into the world? So not just physically going out into and dealing with other nations, but as a scientist, thinking beyond the lab bench, thinking about how my science could impact society, and thinking how to work with policymakers in ways that would be impactful and engaging. And so, in short, I'd like to say that Science and Technology Policy Fellowships are a means for bridging the STEM and policy divide, and more importantly, they're the means for building the human capital that's going to help us address all of the issues that we're facing here, the global threats that are borderless, that are transdisciplinary, that are transboundary, that have lots of nuance to them. We need a special language to be able to do that. And on our own, none of us have that individual training, and these fellowships are a good tool for doing so. And so specifically here in Jordan, in your program you have these wonderful, that you've identified, these next generation Jordanian young researchers, and they're doing fabulous science. And you could really empower them by giving them the opportunity to set up a science and technology policy fellowship where they either engage nationally with their own government or they engage internationally by having the ability to maybe go to the US or go to Europe and see how these programs are made. And so when we talk about the training that scientists need, we no longer just talk about the technical training that you need to be a great scientist. You also need the policy training in order to be an impactful scientist, can change lives and really benefit society, right? And so with that, I'd like to say thank you very much.
So do we have Nita?
Yes.
She's ready? Yes. Ah, okay. Yes.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Neta Lichtman, and I'm the CEO of the Israeli Society of Ecology and Environmental Sciences. Everyone hear me right? Yes. Great. So we established the Mimshak Fellowship Program like 7 years ago. We started with 7 fellows. Nowadays we have 12 each cohort. And we took a lot of ideas from the program. So everything been said before me, why putting scientists inside the government is crucial for decision making. But we focused mainly on environmental issues. On the largest, and you can imagine when I say environmental scientists like transportation, ecologists, biologists, chemistry. We even have someone that his PhD on the history of China, which was connected in a unique way to his work in the agriculture office in Israel. Our training is a bit different. Start with 2 weeks of intensive orientation. Everything you have to know before you go into the office. From what do you mean when you said environmental issues? The third wave is of how to capture the paradigm of environment. What is the government? How do you approach, like even dressing code? It's a huge thing, how you dress to the laboratory and how you go to the office. Even in Israel, if you don't have the tie and the suits, nevertheless, it is obligated. So these are like 2 weeks of very intensive training, and then they go to the offices. They work for full year, October to October. 4 days a week, they work inside the office with a very high, what we call mentor, supervisor. That we also pick, needle pick, like we choose those mentors and the offices, depending on what we call the significant environmental issue that we plan to work to in the following years. And we have, this year we have 25 positions. Offices that wanted one of our fellows, and we had only 2. a demand than we can give to the government. So 4 days a week, they work like sprint. They work don't to dust with the students, sorry, their mentors in the offices, and once a week they come to us for the training. We built it with the School of Government in Tel Aviv University, and once again we give them training which you don't gain when you do your PhD in biology. How to speak in front of the audience, how to economy, law, everything like you need to alongside with personal training. And you were saying beforehand about the network and about the group, and we put a lot of effort making them a group during this year, like for almost 2 hours in the one-day training. They talk inside the group therapy, what are the conflicts they are dealing with, and ways solve them. I want to share screen. Can I do this? I tried it before, so please tell me, does it work? It's fine? Yes. Great. So this is our website, and I wanted just talk a little bit about the curriculum that we give them. So as you can see, it's all about science and policy and public administration, economy, and alongside with developing skills like workshop and science communication. You were talking before me about different culture and how you need to talk and diplomacy. We just call it communication, how to communicate your science in the office, in the media. We put a lot of effort in writing your science. We put a lot of effort in that as well. Each year we have, I want to show the fellows. Each year we have almost 100 applications, people that want to apply for that program. You have to have your PhD if you want to apply, or to have a letter from your supervisor that you are about to finish by October. No one can start the program without having a PhD. And after selecting for almost 6 years, we end up with 10, sometimes 12 graduates, fellows. So we have 7 cohorts and 55 alumni. And here are some success stories. This is from our first cohort from 2011. This is Dr. Anat Bornstein. Just recently she started the Fuel Choice and Smart Mobility in the initiative in the Prime Minister's office. When she first stepped into the office, it was only her and her advisor, which was the manager of the program. Now that she is the leading of this program, and we're very much proud of this, what she made of this office. And another success story, I had so many, it was difficult to pick, but I'll pick another one. So this is Gideon Korov, he's from the 3rd cohort. And Gideon was in the agroecology department in the Ministry of Agriculture. After, when his program ended after 1 year, he was assigned to, and he opened the sustainable ecology in the office, which was a very big thing for us. That's it. Like I chose 2 out of 55. We have 50%, 47% of people that find a way into the government after they finish the program, after 1 year. And the other, some goes back to the academy, but they go different. Like, they saw the war, um, they think differently, they act differently inside the academia. Some became, shoot this down. Some became advisor of science and environment in Israel. And one last thing, this is a joint venture. We are an NGO with the government, 50-50. We were established by the Rothschild Foundation 7 years ago, and Rothschild is leaving us shortly and slowly, but very firm. So we put inside universities. We have now 4 universities supporting us. We have only 7 universities in Israel, and we are about to work with all 7 universities right from next year. So that's about it, I guess. Thank you.
We'll keep you online so you can hear the rest, and then if there are questions, we'll get them typed into you or find a way to get them to you. So Rush is out of the room for a second, so we're gonna go with Howard.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Marga. Thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me to this session. I'm sorry I didn't prepare a PowerPoint presentation, but I will talk about my individual perspective regarding the science policy or the connection between science and policy. I did my PhD in 2003 in the University of Valencia in Spain about developing or estimating biophysical parameters from satellite data, remote sensing. So I did many applications in agriculture, how we can improve water use efficiency in agriculture, how can we study the land cover dynamic using satellite data, etc. But I've never been in contact with policymakers, ministries, or the people who decide. So I was only, doing research at the laboratory, participating in field experiments, etc. But then after the PhD, I got a job in an international organization based in France, Euro-Mediterranean Water Information System, which is an international organization created in the framework of the Barcelona process, which is a political process launched in Barcelona in 1995 to encourage Mediterranean countries to collaborate in many aspects. Some of them, one of the important aspects is collaborating on water. So the idea of this organization is actually to help the Mediterranean countries to develop national water information system. What does it mean? I mean, everybody is aware about the importance of data, sharing know-how, and sharing information. Because without information, without the right information, updated information, harmonized data, the decision maker cannot really be aware of, for example, the water availability, different water users, etc. So to really adopt or take adequate measures to manage the water resources, you need the right information. So we did a lot of work on that aspect, and so I got the opportunity to work closely with the ministries in charge of water of each Mediterranean country. So all the Arab countries, plus Israel, plus the southern Mediterranean countries. So we had like focal points in each Ministry of Water, people who were actually updating their national information on water, what is going on the sector, and trying to make all the actors in the country working together. So, and what's about the connection, science and policy? So we tried from this organization to help the Mediterranean countries not only to develop their own national water information system, but to connect them through a regional water information system. And we tried to work on this and to developing a regional water strategy. So there are many aspects in common with those countries. They all suffer from water scarcity, the impact of climate change, etc. We try to work, so I worked on that closely with many experts, many scientists to write down a sort of strategy which has been approved technically, then submitted to the ministers of water who met in Barcelona in 2010 to be adopted. Unfortunately, again, policy, because of some political divergences at the last moment, it wasn't approved. But the work continued. We launched the Water Experts Group, gathering experts and scientists from different Mediterranean countries to work on an action plan. Even the strategy politically wasn't approved. We tried to make it work at level of at technical level at least. Then also there was another framework, which is a 5+5 or what we call Western Mediterranean countries. So we tried also again to help the ministers of water, the water directors, to develop a regional common strategy on water, covering all the aspects of water supply and water demand management, etc. So this was my experience working in that organization, closely with the decision makers in like ministers of water and water directors and high-level representative of those ministries. 2 years ago, I joined another organization, which is MEDREC, that I'm representing here, the Middle East Desalination Research Center based in Oman. This organization is a fruit of the Water Working Group the Water Working Group multilateral track of the Middle East peace process. So there were various topics. Water was one of the most important topics in this multilateral track. So MEDREC was created in '96 by a royal decree in Oman. MEDREC was created to face two major challenges in the region. First one is water. We know that we have the MENA is considered one of the most scarcest water regions in the world. And then the second objective is contribute to the peace in the Middle East. So we know the conflict that we have in this region. And the third actually axis that MEDREC wants also to focus on, not only to provide an organization to provide solutions to water problems or to provide solutions or contribute to the peace in the region, but also to make such organization a sustainable model or transferable model. I mean, it could be used in other conflicts around in the world, wherever there is a conflict on an environmental issue that could be water, could be energy, could be an ecosystem, etc. Shared ecosystem, shared environment, shared water resources. So we can apply such a model. So it's about having an environmental shared resources. Around we have core parties, countries in conflict. Then we have supporting states that are going to support these core parties in conflict. And then we build a center. The center, we have co-equal partners. In MEDREC, for example, we have 10 member countries. We have co-equal partners. We have a diplomatic statute. So we have representatives from the ministries of foreign affairs of those countries. And we have the technical aspects, scientists and experts who are meeting periodically to discuss about what kind of solutions we can provide to the region, and we focus on desalination. So desalination is one of the major solutions for the water supply. So since the creation of MEDREC, we have been working with the experts from the region. How can we develop sustainable desalination technologies to provide water, to supply water to the countries of the region? Another aspect I want to mention also is that this center has a clear mandate. So as I mentioned earlier, the clear mandate is about seeking fresh water for the countries of the region through developing new technologies of water treatment, desalination, and other aspects of water management. We have a core party commitment, obviously, and we have a mix of bilateral and core party projects. So since the creation of MEDREC, we have been funding research projects. We have been launching or developing a lot of capacity building and training courses. It's like a sort of pipeline through which MEDREC try to pass the training, the research activity, development cooperation, the track 2, so informal dialogues between the core parties and the member states of MEDREC. So the training, especially the capacity building activities, were focusing on many aspects. So some of them are really targeting the decision makers, like a training on tendering. So I think you heard, some of you probably heard about the famous Red Dead Sea project. This is a huge project involving Jordan, Israel, and Palestine to transfer water from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, with the objective to provide like 50 million meter cube per year of water, fresh water to Jordan, 35 to Israel, and 10 millions indirectly to Palestinians. So this huge project is about building some desalination plants on this track between the Red Sea and Dead Sea. You know that Dead Sea is like 400 meters under the level of the sea. So the fresh water will be provided to those countries, and then the brine, the rejected water, very salty water, will be pumped to the Dead Sea. Why? Because as you know, Dead Sea is almost decreasing each year in surface. So probably with this brine, we try to reduce, or decrease the rate of water evaporation or the level of water in the Dead Sea. So the tendering, we help the decision makers to how they can deal with the tendering for such projects, especially the Jordanian Ministry of Water and Irrigation. Also, we do a training on obviously transboundary water management. This is an important aspect. So we have shared water resource in the region, which cause conflict actually. So we try to train the decision makers of those countries and also gather them with other similar cases, Nile Basin, other basins in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, to see how other countries can work together. When they have shared water resources, they can still work together to solve the water problems. Also, another aspect we did training on for the decision makers is the concept of water, energy, food nexus. So we know the interlinkages between water, energy, and food. It's about coordinating at national level and then at regional, international level between the water actors, the energy actors, and the agriculture or the food sector. MEDREC then is playing a role of catalyst in search of water solution in the region, is aiming to be like a professional and credible platform for dialogue and cooperation in water issues between the core parties, and also to provide the international community with a replicable model, as I said, that could be applied anywhere in the world where we have conflicts on a shared water or environmental resource. We can apply the similar model. I think MEDREC actually is the unique surviving organization from the peace process. We know the difficulties and challenges now facing such process. To resume the main activities we develop in MEDREC, so we have trilateral water training program. We have research scholarships we provide to students from Jordan and Palestine mainly, includes coordination with the Ministry of Water and Irrigation Jordan, the Palestinian water authorities. Such a training or such scholarships are to develop masters and PhD on water priorities in Palestine and Jordan. We also have what we call traditional track 2, so again dialogues between the core parties. We have a Gaza research fund. We have urgent applied research project, expert technical advisory panel with many experts and scientists from the core parties and other countries to give advice and provide some support. For example, in Gaza, they have a lot of problems with their desalination plants, so we try to send them experts to fix the problem they have to operate such desalination plants. And strategic training on different aspects I mentioned it, no conventional water resources, water pricing policies, for example. So finally, I think that I got the occasion, through this experience in France, in Oman now, to not stay, in the research in the laboratory, but I get the occasion to interact with the policy makers, with decision makers, influencing them somehow in the policies they adopt. Also, in science diplomacy, how can we make countries in conflict sit together, at least agree on some joint actions. And also, I want to mention also that at the level of research, we try also to build our capacity in research. So for this reason, we have a very good collaboration with the Research Council of Oman, which is the main body responsible on research and science in Oman. So we have very ambitious initiative to be launched very soon, funded by the Research Council and the USAID. It's about a 5 years research program. It will be open for any researcher in the world. We will give funding for the successful proposal to develop a small desalination device that could be deployed to remote areas for humanitarian purposes. So if we have disaster like earthquake, floods, war, we can deploy such devices for humanitarian purposes. Obviously, this is a challenge there is no such solution in the market. Probably the US Army is using something similar, but not really. We need something to remove the salt, to remove the contaminants, and to be affordable, small, etc. So MEDREC, by those activities, encourages the establishment of immersive science policy connection mechanism and try to help the country of the region to respond to the water challenges and to the peace challenges. Thank you very much.
Dr. Narita, I think is next, yes? We have several more speakers, so please, all remaining speakers, be brief.
Good afternoon, everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm the ASEAN US Science Technology Fellow. ASEAN is Association of Southeast Asia. So we consist of 10 countries. And when I started the fellow, actually it's about the right time because it's the declaration of the One ASEAN Economic Community. So free trade and free collaboration in that community. So in 2015-2016 is the time of the fellowship. And similar with the AAAS in the US, I'm also embedded in the government. So in my case, it's in the Ministry of Research, Science, Technology, and Higher Education of Republic of Indonesia. Next. So this is briefly the plan of action of the fellowship. So I have a thematic area in biodiversity because in ASEAN, we have hotspots of biodiversity, and we have problems in, especially in palm oil and the palm fire. So every year, we have a recurrent forest fire that causes fogging in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and now starting getting bigger and bigger. So we have problem with that. So I'm interested in developing policy in biodiversity. And the outputs is trying to link the ASEAN biodiversity roadmaps, align that with the national roadmap so that it will in synergy actions with the Convention of Biological Diversity and also Nagoya Protocol. Next. So I just want to tell you a little bit in our fellowship that we have a professional development coaching. So we are scientists. Some of us are really good writing technical papers. But in policy, we have a different kind of strategy in communication. So we have coaching from the professional development from science communicators in policy writing and economic evaluation. We also receive coaching writing, presentation, including public speaking, and pitching, so elevator pitch, meaning that if you meet policymakers by accident, you have a courage and you have a skill to speak within 2 minutes to say something so that he get interested and ask you to join him later and discuss about the policy. Next. So these are several knowledge and skills that we obtain within a year. So science and technology capacity development, and we, all of us, about 15 people, we went to Vientiane, Vietnam, and it's really interesting, even though within 10 countries, we have, I mean, in one region, we also have cultural differences. So it's really interesting, and I would say that we form a strong bond until now, and we have fun. So it's really a unique experience that the borders of our countries are emerged. So there's no border anymore. And then the second ASEAN conference on biodiversity in Bangkok, and then the Indonesia Science Fund in Jakarta. Next. So interactions with other science and technology fellows in this fellowship is also important. So within Indonesia, in one country, we develop a program that that is focusing on palm oil. So we want to develop a sustainable program for palm oil in Indonesia. That's a national program. And for the ASEAN, we are interested to develop a national roadmap that's aligned with the ASEAN Biodiversity Roadmap. And I did this with 3 other fellows in Philippines, in Thailand, and Indonesia. So 3 of us work together in one project. Next. So these are only pictures, so you maybe you can have some imagination of what we do. This is the training in Jakarta. Next. And we visited Oil Palm Research Institute, and the biggest international multinational company in Sumatra. Next. And then expert interviews. So we meet not only policymakers, we meet business, industry, and any any actors that are related with our science policy development. So we went to Pertamina. Pertamina is the biggest oil company in Indonesia, and also we work with Global Young Economy, ASEAN, to study about the status of young scientists and what should be done to improve the condition for young scientists in the region. Next. So this is the seminar of training in Vietnam. So there of us forming one bond over there. And this is the Vientiane also. Next. And this is the ASEAN Conference of Biodiversity. So we were excited to meet the director of UN Convention Biological Diversity. We also met the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity Executive Director, and we talked to them and tried to connect and ask for their suggestion and about the science policy development. Next. This is the launching of Indonesian Science Fund. So this is the national level, and this is actually the first time that Indonesia started the Indonesian Science Fund that actually modeled the national NSF in the US. And finally, the results that we achieve include the policy brief. So policy brief in Science Technology Park of Bioeconomy that we submitted to the Ministry of Research, Science, Technology, and Higher Education, and also Agency for the Assessment and Application of Technology. And the second policy brief is aligning biodiversity policy. We submitted to Ministry of Research, Science, Technology, and Higher Education, and also Ministry of National Development Planning. Next. And not only that, we are also got training of public writing, so popular science writing. So in order to popularize the scientific methods for common people. So we actually, I published in Jakarta Post. That's one of the quite prestigious media in Indonesia about how can science and technology parks boost the economy. And actually, 3 months after that, they asked me to write about Zika virus because there's an emergency about Zika virus in Indonesia. Next. And then I was invited also as for the Science Technologies in Society Forum in Japan, and we are young scientists are invited to have a dialogue between future leaders and Nobel laureates in order to give a policy brief for STS Forum in the next 100 years. Next. And another science policy recommendations is Science 45. It's actually made by Indonesian Academy of Sciences and Indonesian Academy of Young Scientists. So there's Bruce Albert, the former US science envoy from US, and the National Academy of Sciences. Next. And some of the results from this Indonesian Science Fund is the science policy recommendation on what research focus areas should we have for the first calls of these Indonesian Science Funds. Next. And here I am in one of the magazine, Tempo. Tempo is maybe like Times in the US. So they mention about how important actually it is the ASEAN-US Science and Technology Fellow and how it becomes more needed in our country to provide a scientific based evidence for policy. Next. And also for Global Young Academy, I was invited by the Forum for the Science Diplomacy for International Negotiations and Peace Building. So it's getting more exciting as a scientist. And now after the fellowship over, I'm still doing research, but I also do a consultant. And now it's like the government is becoming aware that they need data for policy development. So for example, Indonesian Science Foundation asked me to develop a strategic plan until 2045, and it's submitted to the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance is the former operational director of World Bank. So she knows a lot about the strategic plan, so it was quite challenging. But I'm happy that I can provide recommendations to the government. And now I'm working on the Science of Biodiversity of Indonesia, working with the Indonesian Academy of Sciences. And the last one is related with SDG, is the Evidence Summit on Reducing Maternal and Neonatal Mortality in Indonesia. And this is the first evidence summit for policy making in Indonesia. So the first example that using method for such a serious case. Mortality, maternal and neonatal mortality in Indonesia still below the SDG target. So we need to increase 70% in 5 years in order to achieve SDG. So we need that information to reach that target. And I'm also like to thank the ASEAN USAID Science and Technology Program and Progress, the ministry, the agency, and all other sectors over there. And I believe that regional science and technology program could be useful and also to form a strong networking among scientists. Thank you. Yes, there are us over there. So.
Okay, can I have yours? Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be very, very brief. Thank you to all our speakers for this wonderful sample of the different approaches and the different strategies that exist to bridge the science policy interface. The reason we organized this session is we wanted to bring you, hopefully demonstrate the value of what we call immersive science policy mechanisms, and that is what Raj was saying in the beginning. The nexus, the bridge is the people, it's not the information, it's not the scientific data, it's not the science information that provides science advice. It's really about the people, because the piece that everybody touched on is the connections, the trust, the friendships, and the continuous interaction between the policy community, the diplomatic community, and the science, and that changes the culture of both, right? And generates that bridge. So, as Raj said, we have this Science and Technology Policy Fellowship for 45 years now. And in the past 10 years or so, we increasingly got more interest from different countries, trying to set up different types of mechanisms, similar mechanisms. But of course, there is no formula that can be replicated. You can't take the blueprint that we have in the US and take it to another country, because it's a completely different political system, scientific system, social, economic, everything is different. So you need to adapt your the mechanism to your country. So when we were seeing all this interest from around the world for this type of mechanisms, we decided to write a report. So we did a research project supported by the Moore Foundation that tries to categorize and map those mechanisms and the different approaches that exist around the world. So we've heard here from a small sample, and hopefully that brings you an idea of the different options. There are many, many options, and these are the options that exist, but there are many new approaches that can be invented to do this. So one of the distinctions is creating a national mechanism versus a regional mechanism. So we heard from our panelists the value of regional mechanisms, so the policies can be aligned through this fellowship cohort. The policies can be aligned between countries, and this happens with the enthusiasm and the energy of the young people. And we think that's very, very valuable, that those fellowships create cohorts that will remain connected throughout their career, and when they reach leadership positions, and all of them will, so that they will already have this mindset of collaboration and of course science diplomacy. And the other point I want to make very brief is that this is not being a science advisor in your expertise necessarily. So we heard about one day you write a policy brief on Zika, and the next day you write a policy brief on climate change or science and technology parks. So how you do that? You're not expert in all of those issues, but what you do is you know who to reach out in the scientific community, and how to get that knowledge and connect the relevant pieces. So you become sometimes you can become more of a generalist, and that's okay. So you don't use your science at the same level anymore. I'm a molecular biologist, and I don't do any molecular biology anymore, but it's really very rewarding to be able to broadly speak about many, many different topics and know how to connect the different pieces. So if you are interested in learning more about this immersive mechanisms, this is a report we launched early this year in February at the AAAS annual meeting, and really it catalogs more than 200 mechanisms that we found around the world, and many of them involve training. So workshops and training, capacity building, very important, not just the actual placement of the scientists in government, but how to provide the training that we've seen is very relevant for all the orientation portions of these programs. So I'm not going to go through the report, but you can see how we reach out. We reach a number of countries, not all of them, and we got input for this report from many, many regions. But one of the regions that was not well represented was this one. We're here now, the Middle East. So we've invited Kathy to try to have a little bit of a discussion with you about how we could, or how we can think about mechanisms that could work for this region, and others, of course. But since we're here, it's worth having this conversation. So I'm going to invite Kathy to take over, and then I'll just show you the last slide. You can stay. We're going to continue after this session is over. If you're interested in discussing more one-on-one and more in a small group, we're going to go to this room, and it should show up, hopefully. Right, the Moata Hall at 6, from 6 to 7:30, and we'll have a more focused conversation on what these types of mechanisms could be here in the Middle East. So, Kathy, you can wave the report.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't looked at the report online, we do have some copies of the executive summary here, and you are welcome to help yourself to them. So just to follow up on what Marga said, when I joined AAAS earlier this year as a visiting scholar, I decided to focus my research on science diplomacy in Arab countries. I wanted to build on a couple events that a couple workshops that I had been involved in here in the region. One was in 2015, a workshop on science diplomacy that the Royal Scientific Society, the ESQUA Technology Center, and CRDF Global had organized. And then a year later, those three organizations came together again with AAAS and with the International Network of Government Science Advice, INGSA, to do a workshop on science advice to governments. In both of those meetings, there was a lot of discussion about the need for more mechanisms and stronger linkages between science and policy in the Arab world. So, and my research at AAAS also builds on the report that Marga just described. Now, the thing about this report is that it is not comprehensive. It was never intended to cover all such mechanisms around the world. In fact, 70% of the mechanisms described are in the US, and most of the other ones are from Europe. There are no examples in this report from Arab countries, and that's a gap that I'm trying to fill by having a more focused discussion and to shine a light on this issue with our partners here in the region. Specifically, I would like to determine if there are any immersive mechanisms similar to those described in the report, so things like fellowship programs, rotations, details. Do any of those kinds of programs exist in Arab countries? Are there opportunities for scientists here to work in policy positions, either on a permanent or temporary basis? And if so, what are the conditions for success? Is there even a demand for such programs? That's something that Rush talked about in his opening remarks, about the challenge of getting the policy community interested in demanding this kind of evidence-based inputs. Perhaps there are other avenues for scientists to engage that are better suited to the environment here. And if so, what are they? What are some good examples? And then lastly, how can international cooperation or international partnerships help to establish or strengthen such linkages between science and policy in Arab countries specifically? How can we work together to help create the demand and build the capacity for providing science advice to policy? So these are questions that will take time to answer. We're not going to have enough time in today's session, but as Marga said, we will adjourn to the Muata room, which is upstairs on this corridor across the hall, at 6 o'clock after we conclude here, and I promise to get people out in time to attend the reception at 7:30. So, but before we adjourn, you've heard some great presentations here today, and I'd like to invite the presenters to come join me on the stage and be ready to take any questions or comments from the audience. Are there any questions? Yes. Can you identify yourself and just shout?
Hi, I'm Nadim from ICORSA, and you mentioned that you talk about. So you mentioned that you talk a lot with policymakers, and sometimes there's a high turnover in policymakers, so new ones every day, and of course personalities play a role. And how would you deal with a difficult person in policy?
Well, from my modest experience, obviously it's true. I mean, the policy makers are, sometimes responding to ideological aspects of their, their agenda, etc. But as far as when we talk about national level, the work that we have been doing in the organization that MWIS in France it was a sort of a participatory approach, not only targeting obviously decision maker, for example, at the level of the Ministry of Water, but also the other actors of the country, private sector, civil society, researchers, etc. So we use it to do that, this process, I mean, at national level, to put all the actors together. Somehow we do a sort of pressure, you know, and that's push for some sort of commitment. At regional level, the same way. I mean, when we organize the annual forum for water directors, the main guys, technical guys, because the ministers not all the time are technical people. So the water director, we gather them annually. All the Mediterranean countries are represented. So we do push them to agree on some like strategy or some action plan. Then the technical people try to execute. So somehow also this again creates some commitment from different countries.
I would say you treat them the same way you would do in experiments in the lab, right? Try again. And so where there's a will, there's a way. And so one person usually in policy isn't the one that's going to hold all the purse strings or hold all of the abilities to make something happen. So you try to identify their pain points and you address them and you ask them, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? And you try to see if it's something that you can create for them. So there's always a give and take. I think it's the same skill that you learn in science, right? You don't do the same experiment and expect different results. So you try to figure out what you evaluate the process, look at your protocol, what should I change, what can I do differently, should I bring other people in to mitigate this relationship, and see if there's a way to move forward with the initiative that you want to do.
Maybe I just add one point, that it's very, I think I'm very lucky that in the fellowship we get training of profiling people. So there's a trick to speak to certain persons. If this person is very, dominant, this is the way how you do it. And this is the way how you do that. It doesn't work one time. You have to keep trying. And also, if there's a change in the government positions, then you just have to go there and explain it again. But the profiling training that we got is very useful, and it works. And it helps me too in approaching people in the ministry. Thank you.
Hi, Sasha Kagansky, Global Young Academy. I'm wondering how to approach the diplomacy, the science diplomacy from the science side when there is a difficult political situation. Politically, it's a dead end, you know, for any attempts of collaboration can be considered as a threat, you know, to national security or related issues. And you mentioned some projects that were involving countries which could be difficult to sit around the table. You know, how would you? What is the strategy here? Would there be a third party, or would there be some special person who has a way in, or other ways? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Actually, from my first experience, we were dealing with data and information. So not all the countries wanted to share such data. I mean, it's considered sensitive, could be linked to the national security. So we tried from at the beginning, said, okay, you don't want to share data, but at least share the sort of main information and success stories. So we started like that. And after years, when they saw that we are getting some results at level of some pilot project, for example, to do pilot project in some river basin and try to monitor the process of water quality assessment from the raw data. Getting common indicators, those sort of benchmarking, and then, you know, give some recommendations, very concrete recommendations to improve the process. So countries get interested with the time. Obviously, it's not easy. It takes time to make countries commit. And again, sometimes you cannot get such commitment on some because you don't want to share data. Regarding my current job, obviously there are some difficulties, but the model that I explained, somehow is working. I mean, that's why we are the only surviving sort of organization from the peace process, Oslo peace process. I mean, we use many tools, as I mentioned, apart from research, joint research project, joint training program, but also some track 2 process, so some informal meeting. So we make people, meet, and with after couple of meetings, we get to them to at least a minimum of commitment. So some projects are of concern, like the Red Dead Sea project I mentioned. It's a strategic project. It's of the benefit of all those countries. So at the end, I mean, they have to collaborate. There are some interests of each country, of those countries in conflict. So at the end, we make them collaborate. So I think somehow in this line we are successful, but at the same time also we are resilient to, because we have times, in policy, sometimes we have very good, somehow good relationship between those countries. Sometimes we have conflict times, so we reduce somehow the activity. We instead of doing, for example, meeting on some, or training, we do, I mentioned some informal meeting with other countries. And the other last point I want to mention, the supporting states that are with us, so, I mean, they put money in, so they fund project. So those countries, I mean, they feel that, I mean, they commit because there is money, there is support from other states. So somehow we encourage them to work together.
Yeah, maybe we should go out.
Let's go to our other questions.
Hello, I'm Anne Cambon-Thompson. I'm doing biomedical research in Toulouse in France, and I'm the champion of the next Euroscience Open Forum that will be next July in France. So my question is inspired by a question I got at the previous ESOF in Manchester from a young PhD student in health sciences from Gambia. And she was asking, when is the right time to approach policymakers when you have a meaningful result that would influence or could influence policies? In her experience, it was either always too early or too late. So my question is how to address the timeline process between the science results timeline and the policy makers timeline.
So I don't think that's always an easy answer. As we know, science can move very slow, and sometimes policy can move even slower. Or you can have the reverse, where science is moving very fast, as in the case of AI technology and cyber technology, and policy is not there yet to catch up, or with CRISPR technology. So I think you should be having a constant dialogue with your policymakers, because none of us can predict when a technology will leap forward, right? No one saw CRISPR coming. And so the idea of being able to, make superhumans or designer babies and all of these things as easily as is possible with CRISPR hadn't really been thought out and planned for in the policy realm. But we did know that we could do cloning. We had Dolly and all of these other things. And so the ethical conversation had started already about where should science go where it can go, or should science have a stop, right? Do you pursue the road all the way down, or do you put in these ethical road bumps that prevents you from moving forward? So I think the only way to prepare for those is to be having continuous dialogue between scientists and policymakers. I don't think you do it when you have a product. I think you do it when you start thinking and generating ideas, and when you're planning for society. So like the SDG goals, those are 17 agenda items that are a plan for how we make peace and sustainable planet. That is a continuous conversation that we have. We don't wait until we have, something concrete. We're designing together. So if we're working together and collaboratively, then we can avoid some of the road bumps that we encounter. And so I think it's a continuous conversation.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions, so you will go first.
Hi, I'm Marta Vasconcelos from Portugal. I have a comment and a question, I guess. I just recently, we are supposed to provide policy advice to financing agencies, so it's more and more requested, and you see that in the project calls and the call descriptions that you're supposed to help with policy, but there's oftentimes this gap. And for example, with Horizon 2020, in a project that we've recently started, we've been allocated a policy officer by the Commission. And this policy officer is supposed to accompany our project and our results and have an active dialogue with us throughout time so that we can more actively help in providing policy, in this case for European Commission. So I think something like this with other funding agencies across the globe, if they can think of us as a system where there's a policy officer allocated to projects, maybe that could help in making things implemented more easily. Just a suggestion.
Let's take 2 quick questions. We'll take them both, and then you can answer both of them. So I think you had one, yeah?
Okay, great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. My name is Sahil Shah. I'm from the United States, and I'm here with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. My question is for our American panelist. It's specifically on the SDGs. So I think when we moved from the Millennial Development Goals to the SDGs, one of the largest benefits I saw is that it's seemingly less discriminatory. So you can now use the SDGs to talk about American political or scientific issues, such as the Flint water crisis, to the need of science and tech in nuclear nonproliferation agreements for verification. There's so much that you can now use from the UN and project it onto not just the developing world, but also the developed world. So in the current political environment, do you find that the SDG tools have given you more of a space to talk about these issues? Or do you feel as though that the environment within the US is still as restrained as ever?
So before you answer that, let's take the last question.
Thanks for the panelists for the informative presentation. My name is Ahmed. I'm from Saudi Arabia. My question is generic, actually. The question is how to assess the success of the science diplomacy in demonstrating the peace and achieving the sustainable development. And are there any metrics that could be used to measure or to assess this success? Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So the 2 questions are kind of linked, and I was prepared. so this is a map from that was published recently in the World Economic Forum Agenda magazine, and it shows what the countries are doing in terms of reaching the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So in the light blue are the high achievers, right? These are our type A personality countries. And then all the way to the end, the gray ones, those are the couch potatoes, not doing very much. Just hanging out at home, really. And so you see that the blue countries, Canada, we all love Canada, and a lot of European countries, and again, the Scandinavian countries leading the way as always, and then the couch potatoes, the US. Not leading the way, as always, when it comes to sustainable development goals and international agreements. And so this is a very interesting, you talk about metrics and how do you measure this. So the WEF agenda, they are measuring how committed the countries are to funds, right? So is your money where your mouth is? So we can all talk a very good game about wanting to advance this agenda, but are we putting financial dollars behind it? That's one metric. Number 2, are you implementing new programs in terms of like these immersive experience, the science and technology policy programs? And for each agenda item from 1 to 17, each of those comes with their own sort of breakdown of what we need to do to advance and reach those goals. And how much fidelity are you setting up to reach those goals, and in what timeline are you planning to do that? So it's interesting, before I read this article, I had the notion that countries that are practicing science diplomacy more, like the US, and countries that had a lot of these immersive experience for scientists to learn about policy, might be the ones leading the way. But you'll see the AAAS program in science and technology has been running for 45 years, but we're couch potatoes when it comes to the SDGs. So there's not a direct link between training your scientists to talk to policymakers if the administration is not willing to do any of the things necessary, right? So it's you can do all the training that you'd like with your scientists, but until the policymakers really engage, those numbers aren't going to move. Yeah?
Okay. I know there are more questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time to take all of them, but you can perhaps speak to the presenters after the session. Please join me in thanking our presenters. And thank you for joining us. And if you're interested in further discussion focused on Arab countries, please join us upstairs.